I'm your guy Insomniac, and today we are talking famous watches. So this is the first episode of a brand new segment that I'm trying out here on the channel, because obviously anybody who has a fascination with watches has a fascination with watches that have appeared or starred in famous roles or that famous people wear. And I'm not talking about gaudy, iced out, expensive purchases by the rich and famous necessarily. I'm just talking about watches that are highly recognizable, maybe because of a movie they were in, or because somebody famous or iconic maybe wore one of these pieces during an important time in history. And not all of the watches that I'm going to do episodes on are necessarily famous. For example, this episode features a watch that was worn by somebody very famous and in a movie that is still known to this day. This really isn't a famous piece, not even because of this movie, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So like I just said, this particular watch, not necessarily famous still to this day, but it was worn in a classic iconic film by somebody who was super cool, so I figured it was worth a closer look. And the classic movie we're talking about in this episode is Bullitt. It was released in October 1968, and the movie actually takes place in 1968, so this watch is actually kind of period correct for the time in which it was filmed and was supposed to be based. The man who wore the watch in this movie was the legendary Steve McQueen, who actually behind the scenes was a watch lover and owned quite a few iconic pieces that were much more well known than the watch he wore in the movie Bullitt. The watch he wore in this role was actually a period correct civilian adaptation, if you would, of a military issue watch that was issued to GIs during the Vietnam War. The watch is called the Benrus Series 3061. In the mid-60s, this brand was supplying watches to the US military that actually used the exact same movement. The main differences were that the military spec watch actually used a matte-coated parkerized case as opposed to the polished case on the 3061. The military watches didn't have the Benrus brand name on the dial, and the military watches had a lume-covered second hand as opposed to the red-tipped painted second hand that you see on the 3061. The movement in the 3061 is the DR2F2, which, like I said, is the same movement used in the military watches, which based on my research is actually just a Benrus dressed version of the 17-jewel ETA 2372 from that period. The diameter of this piece is pretty small by modern standards, but for back in the mid-60s was actually a pretty common size. It was 34 millimeters. In the days of Bullitt, this was not a special one-off piece made for the movie or for Steve McQueen. It wasn't even a limited production watch. It was a standard production watch back then, which means although it's no longer in production, you can actually still find these watches occasionally in pretty good shape on places like eBay or certain watch forums, and usually for under $500. In terms of popularity, this watch didn't really have any kind of starring role in the film, even though the main character who Steve McQueen played was wearing it throughout most of the movie. And because it was a pretty common watch at the time, it wasn't flashy or expensive or limited or even necessarily an iconic brand name, most people didn't even really notice the watch. So even though Bullitt was a cool, iconic classic people still watch today, and Steve McQueen is still known to this day, the popularity of the movie and the actor who wore it really didn't do much to launch the popularity of the watch. It's more of a watch nerd kind of if you know kind of a piece that flew under the radar. But it is a cool old piece that I thought was worth highlighting from a cool old movie that I actually enjoy. If you have any ideas for famous watches or watches in iconic roles or anything along these lines that you'd like to see me do an episode on, leave it down in the comments and I'll take a look and see if maybe that's worth doing an episode on. If you want to see a lot more content come to this channel, there is a Patreon account linked at the top of the video description. I could always use the support over there. Lots of great watch reviews and watch content coming soon. And I will see you all at the next one.